So anyway, good evening, all of you. And it has been raining and raining and raining, and I think some people are probably busy building an ark or something. Uh, uh, wrong story for this season, in any case. Anyway, good to see those of you who made it tonight to the temple despite all that rain out there. And of course, good to see all of you on Zoom. We are going to go ahead and start this second class on Introduction to Buddhism. So this second class, the title of this lecture is What Are You? I'm Awakened. So this is the first of two lectures on the Buddha. This lecture will be focused on the Buddha's life and lives. So in a little bit, you'll know what I'm talking about. Then the practicum is going to be, the question for the practicum is, what is refuge? Of course, we'll go back and look at the assignment from last week. Anyway, Alex, go ahead and share screen now. Okay. Good. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so first we're going to cover some unfinished business from last week, just to elaborate a little further. And then we're going to look at what I call historical considerations, which is like, how much can we really know about the Buddha, like from the perspective of a historian? Yeah. And then we're going to look at the life of the Buddha, or the legend of the Buddha, as most Buddhist traditions have come to understand what his life was about, what happened in his life, and why what happened in his life was important, and why it makes a difference. And so that would be the third part. So let's go to unfinished business. Here I want to bring this map up again, so that, let's see. Pointer. So this is basically, the map of northern India, this area. So that's western part and eastern part. If you remember, the Indus Valley civilization was really on this western part, way back. The first kind of appearance of urban cities, very well organized, laid out cities, was on this side. Then, for reasons that we are still, unclear and don't know, that civilization died out. The second urbanization happened in this area that is called the Greater Magadha area. So this is Magadha, and so the surrounding areas here is the Greater Magadha. And last week I talked about how until recently, if you look at even in fact, majority of books on the origins of Buddhism will present the scenario that the Buddha was basically either a combination of continuing Brahmanical, meaning Vedic religion, continuing patterns in Vedic religion in some ways, and challenging Vedic religion in other ways. And that's the standard story that you're going to hear, standard thing that you're going to read. But actually, in more recent scholarship, I think the case has been made that, in fact, where the Buddha lived and where he was active, so this is where his family was based in. Kapilavatthu in Pali is the main city in the kingdom of the Shakyas. So he came from the Shakya kingdom. So that's why he was also called Shakya Muni, meaning the sage of the Shakyas. So this is the area that he is from. So this whole area here basically culturally had its own distinctive culture. So that the Buddha wasn't so much reacting against Vedic or Brahmanical. And in fact, if you look at his early, those teachings from that we know came from this early period rather than other teachings, and we'll look at those things. In the earliest layer of the Buddhist teachings, you don't see the Buddha expressing any kind of like animosity or anything towards the Vedic tradition. And in fact, I'm not saying that he was for it either, simply rather irrelevant. So when we looked at the 6 heretical teachers last week, remember, none of those 6 actually had anything to do with the Vedic tradition, had anything to do with the Brahmanical tradition. And they were listed basically in these early Buddhist texts as the main, heretical, like the adversaries. I mean, it was adversary in the intellectual sense. And then in another early source, there's a mention of like 10 alternative ways of explaining things. 10 alternative systems. Again, in those 10 systems, Brahmanical religion is not clearly singled out or identified. So it seems like now there's a very convincing case being made that Magadha area had its own characteristics. And we're going to talk a little bit about those characteristics. Yes?
So, in like where Siddhartha lived, did they necessarily like follow the Brahmanic tradition or just?
No, it's just they know it exists because it's dominant here in this area, but it's just kind of like it's there. It's not something you fight with. It's not something that you are part of.
So not necessarily religion.
Sorry?
So is there necessarily or not religion?
Where?
Where Siddhartha was.
Yeah, there's Magadha religiosity. Yeah, which is not necessarily Brahmanical. Yeah, so we'll look at that. So here to zoom in, some of the important sites, of course, it's already here. Bodh Gaya is going to be important because this is where the Buddha claimed, Siddhartha claimed that he attained enlightenment. Before that, it's simply called Gaya. Yeah, Bodh Gaya is a Buddhist name, where enlightenment, Bodhi, was achieved, so Bodh Gaya. Rajagriha is an important city close to Bodh Gaya. So then you have Vaishali, these are, so Varanasi, which is admittedly the most like sacred city for all Hindus. It's over here in Varanasi. During Buddha's time, probably Brahmanical Vedic traditions were active here. And then Savatthi, or also called Shravasti, is it here? Anyway, this is an area that the Buddha actually spent a lot of time at with his disciples up here in Savatthi. And if you go up from here, Lumbini is south of Kapilavatthu, and that's where he was born. Yeah. And further south, Kushinara or Kushinagara is where he would pass away. Yeah. So here, these are just to get an idea where things are. And last week somebody asked about Tibet. So Tibet is way over here on the other side of the Himalayas. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So some of the unfinished business. Yeah. So as I mentioned already, so on the one hand, there is Vedic Brahmanical religiosity. And I briefly talked about that. It's the idea of order and the universe and its order came from a primordial sacrifice of this entity called the person. And from the body of the person, the four classes of Vedic society was distinguished. Highest among them are the Brahmins, and so you call it the Brahmanical religion, because they are considered as the most important of the four groups. And then also the notion that it's obligatory to give to Brahmins. So non-Brahmins within the Brahmanical system are obligated to support and to give to Brahmins. Then for the Brahmins, to be upright and good Brahmins, you have to willingly, you could say, live simple. And not exactly a vow of poverty, there isn't that, but it's admired when you as a Brahmin live very simply. But a Brahmin is not celibate, so there's no, within this system of the four classes, no advocacy for celibacy. These are all biological lineages. So Brahmins marry, then the next group, the Kshatriyas, they marry. So all four classes, and this is basically four broad classes of Brahmanical society. So where does this renunciate celibate system come from? Well, one way is it says that it developed from within Brahmanical society. But the other theory now is that, well, it might have to do with these other guys further east in this Magadha area. And some people would link that to perhaps pre-Vedic, meaning Indus Valley influence. But that's really, I would say, a speculation. You can't really tie it so clearly to Indus civilization. So anyway, greater Magadha religiosity, when it becomes available to us, where we can see it clearly from historical sources, is around the time of the Buddha, maybe 1 or 2 centuries back, starting from the 6th century, 7th century, 6th century BCE. In this Magadha area, we begin to see the appearance of these ascetic groups. These ascetic groups that practice renunciation, which is what this word sannyasin means, renunciation. Now, this idea of sannyasin eventually gets codified into Brahmanical religion. So eventually, not in the earliest layer of Brahmanical beliefs, but it didn't take long for Brahmanical society to begin to articulate this notion of 4 stages of life. And that ideally everyone in Brahmanical society would go through these 4 stages of life, especially Brahmins, since they are like the model of how you should live. And so ideally is you begin as a student, then when you have been trained in knowledge and in a trade, then you become a householder. After you become a householder and you procreate, raise your children, send them to be educated, then you can do what we would call retirement. Except that now, in this system, you became a forest dweller, not a Florida dweller, but a forest dweller. And what you do when you go into the forest is you go in with your spouse, if he or she is still alive. And then you focus on the Vedic traditions, the faithful daily performance of all the rituals of men, because it's through sacrifice, right, that society is maintained, cosmos is maintained, all order is maintained through sacrifice. So these forest dwellers would live like that until a certain point, they would become sannyasins. So often, if that happens, it's usually one of the two passes away, the other one by default becomes a sannyasin. And at that point, it's a celibate, may be irrelevant at that point, but now they are celibate renunciates. This is Brahmanical society perhaps figuring out how to absorb bad influence from the eastern side, from the, pretend the map is still here, the Magadha side. In the Magadha area, things were not worked out in such a tidy way. There's no notion of the 4 stages of life. In fact, a lot of young people were leaving. And that might be associated, again, as I mentioned, with the rise of cities. The urbanization, this is called the second urbanization of northern India. Yeah, the last one was, 1,000 at least years ago. So with this second urbanization, again, people were not equipped to handle all the chaos that came from the mixing of different peoples. And so in the early Buddhist texts, you find descriptions of people complaining about pollution, complaining about trash, complaining about disease, because cities are basically disease-bearing places. Well, as we recently found out. And then people moved to Asheville. Sorry, did you move to Asheville recently? So this is the background, right, that we talked about. Now, we have to look beyond. Last week we talked about the 6 traditions briefly. I highlighted a couple of them and how the Buddha said, this is not how things work, right? There I emphasize mostly what you would call philosophical matters, right, in our terms. Bear in mind that in India, religion and philosophy are not 2 different domains. They are the same domain. If it is philosophical, it's necessarily religious. If it is religious, it's necessarily philosophical. Surprised me when I came to the US, as an 18-year-old going to college, and there's philosophy department and religious studies, and they often don't see eye to eye. That's not the case in most of Asia, definitely not in South Asia. Yeah? So it will be kind of a very skewed picture if you thought that it was just what we would call philosophy, which is like, how did this come about? What is this about? What is life about, right? Those types of questions that we entertain. So we also need to look at the other side that we would call the religious side. So in the religion that is common, the religious elements that is common to both Magadha and beyond the Magadha area, including the Brahmanical tradition, gods and spirits inhabit this universe, this place, alongside us. Just as non-human animals, we would say, just as non-human animals is a type of being, there are also these beings that are devas, gods, and then a whole gamut of spirits. And they all have different species within the spirit world. Or you could say there are the devas, then there are the yakshas, then there are the kumbhandas, there are the buddhas, then there are the rakshasas, and so on and so forth. So it's a world inhabited with many different classes of beings. Then there are nagas, which are these serpent, snake, dragon spirits. Rakshasas are giants. Yakshas are flesh-eating forest dwellers. And a whole pantheon of all these beings. The relationship between the living and the dead among the Magadha population, there is a strong belief in, technically there's no the dead. because the dead is only in relation to the living, whereas those who have died have gone on to another form of life, what you might call reincarnation, but in Buddhist terms, more accurate, we would say rebirth. We'll look at that, what's the difference. So Magadha area, many groups seem to accept this notion of that when you die from this life, you are born into another life. And that goes on and on and on. Again, in the early layers of the Vedic tradition, no hint at all in their material of this idea of rebirth. Instead, in the Vedic universe, basically there is the realm of the living, then there is the land of the ancestors, and then there are the devas. So when humans die, they go to the land of the ancestors. And in the land of the ancestors, they continue to live insofar as they are living descendants performing regular rituals to maintain them in the land of the ancestors. If there's no living descendants or living descendants have forgotten them, then they too perish from the land of the ancestors. Yeah? And so variations of that belief were also in the Magadha area. So it's kind of a mix. The point about this Brahmanical religion is that it's not saying that Brahmanical religion didn't exist in the Magadha area. It's just that its dominance is not as strong as we have thought that it was. Yeah. Then this phenomena of renunciation, which is basically people saying, you know what? Mainstream society and its values, I reject. Yeah, so these were the original hippies. Except that these hippies, it's not, make love and not war. It's like, don't make love and don't make war. Both of that. Yeah, so these believe in the need to cut off ties with your biological family and even with your friends and all relations. Now, to what degree they cut off their relationship, it varied from group to group to group. There were groups that basically advocated complete cut. And then there were also groups that in fact are not really groups. Basically, someone will initiate you and then you disappear. You don't follow that person. You disappear, never to be seen again. You have gone into the forest. So there are sannyasins, renunciates of that type. So these are a number of different terms that you find in both Buddhist and non-Buddhist sources from that period. Sannyasin is a renunciate, someone who has gone away from secular society, that has willingly given up biological continuity, reproduction. And they are also called Shramana. Shramana are those who strive. What are they striving? They're striving against the norm. They are striving against what mainstream society is telling them to be meaningful to invest in. Yeah? I think I mentioned briefly last time, now we tend to think, celibacy and monasticism is part of the church or part of organized religion, part of, status quo. Actually, if you really think about what celibacy means, what monasticism means, it's a radical act of rejecting everything that society finds to be most important. The very means for society to reproduce itself, renunciates say, I reject that. Yeah? And beyond that, it's saying, I don't shop anymore. I don't celebrate the holidays you celebrate anymore. I don't do birthdays anymore. I don't do weddings anymore. All of that, right? So they are also called parivrajaka. meaning those who have wandered off. Wandered off. Bhikshu, another term, and this term the Buddha eventually adopted for his monks. Bhikshus basically not big shoes. Bhikshu here means those who rely on alms, meaning your food that you eat, you rely on others. Achelaka, the Jains, those are naked ascetics. In the Jain religion, in fact, there are two types of ascetics belonging to the two major divisions in Jainism. One is called the cotton-clad, and the other one is called the sky-clad. Yes, sky-clad. So they are the Achelaka. There are some funny stories about Buddhist nuns living next door to these Achelakas. And then one day, because of monsoon, excessive rain, like right now, the wall that separates the two came tumbling down. And the nuns were just horrified by these naked ascetics right next to them. And so they became very bad neighbors, and they were arguing and fighting. And the Buddhist nuns are cursing these naked ascetics and say, no sense of shame, you people are shameless, rotten, all kinds of very interesting words. And then the naked ascetics, also went at the nuns and cursed them out. Finally, both of them went to the Buddha and complained. And the Buddha says, stop fighting. Just rebuild the wall. You have stories like that in this early collection of scriptures. A very human picture of this early community. Anyway, and the Jatila, I forgot the definition of the Jatilas. So got distracted by the naked ascetics, bhikshus, those who beg for alms, right? Now, here, how do we tie the gods, spirits, renunciation, and society together? Because when these guys became sannyasins or shramanas or bhikshus, what we see is that instead of society saying, oh, you lazy bums, like why should we support you? In fact, it seems like everybody is happy to support them. Yeah, everybody is happy to support them. So there didn't seem to be a lot of complaints against these, well, you could say freeloaders, right? But instead, what you see is admiration for what they are doing, that they are strivers, shramanas, that they're doing something different. Of course, we have looked at how, their philosophical positions, and so for sure, there were some who were very impressed by the deep thoughts that were going on, right? These are like the intellectuals of their society. But there are also more practical reasons, it seems, for the support of these groups. Because a lot of times, these groups of ascetics are believed to hold a special type of power to negotiate between the realm of the living and the dead. And then between the living and the other types of living. Yeah? So with regards to the dead, there are also this belief that, yes, before being born into another life, there is a limbo period where you are technically dead, but not like dead and quiet, dead and potentially complaining and causing trouble. This is not just other people's dead. This is also your own dead. Yeah? In a society where a lot of premium is placed on obedience and piety towards parents, towards elders, you can't really complain about them. Now they are dead. The resentments turn into ghosts. This is when having these guys around is very useful because they can negotiate. Yeah? So there's the notion of when we give food to these ascetics, we nourish our dead ancestors. Then the other types of living creatures, the yakshas, the gandharvas, the Buddhas, these groups also are very useful. So there is, let me read you. There is, in one of these early Buddhist monastic texts, let me see if I can find that passage. So this story has a Brahmin actually coming to the Buddha and requesting the Buddha for help. Yeah, and so this Brahmin says to the Buddha, "Reverend, all sorts of malignant nagas and malignant yakshas have been subdued by the Blessed One," the Buddha. "Now this yaksha Gardaba has been a long time hostile towards us who are not hostile, an enemy to us who have no enemy, hurtful to those who have done no hurt. Whatever children are born, he snatches away. Ah, might the Blessed One subdue Yaksha Gardaba out of compassion." And at that time, the Yaksha Gardaba had come and was seated in the assembly. The Blessed One addressed him, "Did you hear that, Gardaba?" This complaint that was just lodged. "I heard, Blessed One." "Did you hear?" "Yes, Blessed One. You must cease from this evil which is contrary to the Dharma." "O Blessed One, I will cease on one condition. If they have a vihara," which is a monastery, "if they have a vihara for the community of monks from the four directions constructed in my name, then I will stop harming them." The Blessed One then addressed the devout Brahmins and householder of Mathura, the city they came from. "Did you hear, Brahmins and householders?" "Yes, we heard, Blessed One. We will have it constructed." So the construction of monastery was believed to help these spirit beings. In fact, again and again, there is the story of how Shramanas, by the power of their moral character, can subdue harm coming from these spirits. There were alternatives to this, which is forceful magic. So like one of the Vedas, the last one, the Atharva Veda, has a whole gamut of rituals for fending off malignant forces, for destroying evil, for exorcism, and so on and so forth, and for a whole host of human ailments, which is believed to have been caused by unhappy entities of this type. Here in the Buddhist sources and other traditions from that period, the notion of like these sannyasins, not by the power of incantation, like mantras, not by the power of ritual, but by the power of their moral status, by the power of them training their minds, overcoming hatred, overcoming resentment, jealousy, by them being celibate, they gain a kind of power that is moral in nature, and that moral power can quell disturbances. That moral power can heal illnesses. And so that you didn't need to do complicated rituals. Yes, the Shramanas might still come and do some recitations. But the recitations, when you look at them, it always, like in these early recitations that are done, it's often said, the wordings will say things like, by the power of our loving kindness, by the power of our moral integrity, by the power of truth, may this be quelled. May this disease stop. So this notion of truth itself having a power, love itself having a power, patience itself having a power to heal, a power to overcome malignant forces from the unseen world. Yes, so renunciation society comes together with the gods and the spirits in this manner. Yeah. So let's look at the next slide. Now, main part, the historical considerations. Oops, sorry. We don't have any explicit contemporaneous sources, either from the Brahmanical tradition or from the Jain tradition. The other, remember the 6 groups, right? One group is Jain. Jain is the only religion that continues to today. And if the other 5 wrote anything or mentioned anything about the Buddha, they didn't survive. And so we don't have anything from the other groups. The one group that survived, they don't seem to know who this person that Buddhists call Buddha, the awakened one, was. So there's no contemporaneous sources. Also helpful to keep in mind, within the Buddha's own time, people did not write down religious matters. People used writing for commerce and mundane things like, basically commerce. Who owes what to whom? Keeping track of things like that. Recording secular history. Sacred history, sacred lore, sacred texts, they were all oral texts. So the Jains did not bother. They didn't even talk about fights with Buddhists. Whereas the Buddhists remembered their fights with the Jains. So as much as Buddhists don't want to admit it today, probably, they were probably not that important. The Jains didn't care to notice them. So that's kind of interesting. Compare it to Jesus. There's one reference in a Jewish historical text that he was named. So that was written within his lifetime or one generation. An external reference to Jesus, one case. And this is about 300-400 years later, in a culture that had writing and all that, that used writing to record important things. But in India, the important things you do not write. And that's very much part of Vedic Brahmanical tradition. So we don't have contemporaneous external sources. So we cannot verify his existence that way. But what we do have from a little later are these epigraphical sources. So you have records carved in stone and monuments built in memory of him, coming from a century, 2 centuries later. The scholarship today, no one who does serious scholarship would outright deny the existence of this person. And so I think that much is settled. That yes, there was a historical basis to what Buddhists call the Buddha. And the dates that have been most commonly accepted are these dates, that he was probably born 566 and lived till 486. More or less 80 years. Okay, footnote. Living up to 80 years in 566 BCE is the equivalent of saying, he lived till 145. But again, it seems like this is not an exaggeration, that he did live that long, which is really extraordinary for that time, but not humanly impossible. Yeah, it's possible, right? So he lived, in all Buddhist sources from the earliest time, it said that he lived till he was 80. In some traditions, it said that he lived till he was 81. Now, these dates, how do we have these dates? Just to give you an idea of how these dates are arrived at, because of one important person in Indian history, which is the king called Ashoka. King Ashoka, the king of the Maurya Empire, was a great king of India. And his dates, we are fairly sure. We're not 100% sure. We are fairly sure of Ashoka's dates. And Ashoka's dates are around 304 to 232 BCE. In Buddhist sources, basically, there are two datings that says Ashoka lived 100 years after the Buddha passed away, or Ashoka was born 100 years after the Buddha passed away, or Ashoka was born 218 years. Not sure what that number is about. But whenever numbers are given in Indian texts, you have to be a little suspicious. Because numerology is something important. Yeah, so the symbolism of numbers sometimes is really important. I remember one time when I was a graduate student at University of Virginia, there was an Indian professor, an econ professor that was a visiting scholar, and I met him. And then, very interesting guy. But one of the things he said was, he was like, everywhere else, with some exaggeration, he said, everywhere else, he says, when people count things, you say, how many people are there in this room? Well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and count. He says, that's how the rest of the world counts. In India, this is how you count. You walk into a room and you say, there are 81 people here. Because 81 is a significant number. So one on this side, one on the other side. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you count until you arrive at 81. Yeah. There is the front of the person and the back of the person and the left of the person and the right of the person. There's 4 there, if necessary. Yeah. So numbers are a little suspicious. But again, this number is consistent. Yeah? Some sources say he was born 100 years after the Buddha, and some 218. So from there, from Ashoka's dates, once we can determine Ashoka's dates, and Ashoka's dates are not impossible to determine within a range of 5-10 years. Why? Because of his pillars. He built these huge pillars, like the one you see here, that have lasted till now. So from those pillars, there are dates on the pillars that say, this number of years in the reign of Ashoka. These pillars are built because the edicts of Ashoka, his laws for the land, are all carved onto these pillars so that everybody who can read can see what the laws are, what the guidelines are. And Ashoka was a Buddhist emperor. So Ashoka is very important in terms of helping us date Siddhartha. So Siddhartha was born in the Gautama family and part of the Shakya clan. And so his kingdom was the kingdom of the Shakyas. As I've mentioned last time, he was born in what's called in the early text a Rajan family, which is now translated Raja as kings. But back in that time, it's probably aristocratic family. And the other thing that I mentioned is it wasn't a monarchy, it was an oligarchy. Later Buddhist traditions would make his father the king and would turn that system into a monarchy, because when later stories of the Buddha were composed, India was already in the hands of monarchies. Yeah? The dominant political system was monarchic. And so now in translating, right, the life of the Buddha into a context that resonated with people, his father was this great king. But what we do know is that his father was an important elder in this community. So definitely lived a privileged life, but it is said that he was not satisfied. And like many young men at his time, he wasn't that unusual. In that period, he eventually left his position of privilege and became a shramana, and then wandered around for a number of years. Yes?
So, a lot of people put religion into orders of two things, monotheistic and polytheistic, but is the Buddhism more
It's
any of those?
Yeah, a lot of people, meaning people who are monotheistic, came up with that. Right? Once you say you're mono, then you have to deal with the poly. If you are quote unquote polytheistic, you will never dream up this idea of mono. Does that make sense? You would never dream up this idea that it's mono, because you look around, there's nothing mono that you see anywhere around you. So monotheism has produced polytheism as the other. But in this world, it made no sense to think in those 1 and 2 terms. I think it's irrelevant. Of course, people, in fact, these both Brahmanical sources and non-Brahmanical Magadha sources, they do ask questions of that sort, but not about theo, not about God necessarily, but about, is this fundamentally one or many? Is there something that is underlying all of this that is singular? And out of that singularity, multiplicity came up? Those questions were asked, but not so much theo, like a single God or many gods. That didn't seem to occupy their intellectual energy. Yes?
What city and what language were King Ashoka speaking?
Ashoka in which city? If you go back to the map, yeah. Ashoka, let's see. Not here. In terms of language, Ashoka in Magadha area, but down here. And the language that they use it's not classical Sanskrit. What we call classical Sanskrit came later. So this is a Prakrit, which it's very complicated. But it's not classical Sanskrit. Remember, Vedic Sanskrit is even more archaic. That by the Buddha's time, a lot of people don't know what exactly it's saying. I mean, they can all read it, but what does it mean? Many people don't know what it means anymore. Then classical Sanskrit came later. Then there's also a type of Sanskrit that we call Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, but it's not, this is just like modern contemporary terms, they were legitimate languages, to call it. For a long time, I thought Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit was a bunch of Buddhists sitting together and come up with a different Sanskrit. just to be different from classical Sanskrit. But as I educated myself more on this issue, it's basically two different types of Sanskrit that developed at some point and separated, and for lack of a better term, they call it Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit because Buddhists seem to use that particular form of Sanskrit. Yeah. More than that, I can't say. Yeah, so anyway, so coming back to what we can know, is that then at this place called Gaia, he had a profound experience, which he then referred to as Bodhi, which means awake. That he had this experience that he said that he woke up and then he began to gather disciples and to tell the disciples, just as I woke up, you too can wake up. You too can wake up. So this band of disciples followed him around. They live a semi-itinerant life, but within the Buddha's lifetime, it seems like this phenomena of monasteries have begun, but not the way we might think of monasteries today. More like buildings were built where they would stay in for periods, long periods of time. But still, there is quite a bit of moving around. Yeah. Then at an old age, 80, he died in Kushinagara. Next slide. These are some of the images. So these are some of the pillars of Ashoka. And these are the inscriptions. Some of the inscriptions. Yeah, this one is in Sarnath, I believe. Or is it in Lumbini? Yeah, this Ashoka pillars have this characteristic of the lions and then the wheel of Dharma. Next. These are also from Ashoka times. Yeah, see this when they first dug it up and they clean it up, and you have that other image. This famous Buddha of Sarnath is now in an Indian museum. A very famous statue of the Buddha of Sarnath. So one of the biggest edict stone of Ashoka. This might be in, I don't know, is it in Pakistan now? I'm not sure. This is in Bodh Gaya. So Ashoka built a throne to symbolize the Buddha's presence in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha attained awakening, where Siddhartha became Buddha. So this is the throne, and this is like some of the details from that throne. Next. Now, I think I don't have to say much because the story of the Buddha, I think most of us know the basic contours of that. So the earliest stories or the earliest elements that we can find about the story of the Buddha is found in these recorded discourses called Sutra. In the Sutra, there might be indirect references to the Buddha's life. Buddha might say, oh, you know, when I was young, I did this, that. Usually the structure of the sutra is some people came to the Buddha, asked the Buddha some questions, the Buddha answered those questions, and the exchange between them, Buddha teaches a lesson. The lesson could be on patience or loving kindness or overcoming afflictive emotions. So generally there are records, right, of these conversations, not even sermons, but conversations that the Buddha had with people, right? And each of them are called a sutra. Then in these sutras, some of them have biographical references. Also in the Vinaya, which is the collection of monastic rules, right? And stories about how these rules came about. Right? In fact, in a lot of these stories, if you read through them, you get a good sense of how the early Buddhists understood who was this person called Buddha. Very interesting profile. So fuller accounts about the life of the Buddha, like accounts that call themselves, in fact, the biography of the Buddhas, they don't turn up until 2 or 3 centuries later. So one of the earliest one is called the Buddha Charita, composed in the early 2nd century. The Mahavastu, 2nd century as well, Lalita Vistara, and then the Nidana Kata. The first 3 were composed in Sanskrit, and then the last one is composed in another ancient Indian language called Pali. Pali eventually becomes the main canonical language of Theravada Buddhism. In both of these Sanskrit and non-Sanskrit sources, they develop this idea that the Buddha's life had a number of characteristics that will be the same for all those beings that become Buddhas. So in the Sanskrit sources, they talk about the 12 deeds, 12 things that all Buddhas would do, with some variations, but these are the 12 things that they will do. And then in the Pali tradition, they talk about 30 features that all Buddhas will demonstrate, will go through in their life, in their final life, when they become Buddha. So briefly, I'm not going to lay out all the 12 deeds, but the first deed, if we're talking about the 12 deeds, actually starts with the life before he was born as Siddhartha. There it is said that he was living as a deva, what we would call a god, in one of these higher spiritual realms called Tushita. So Tushita is sometimes translated as like the joyful place. Yeah. So Siddhartha was a deva in the Tushita realm. And in fact, at that point, it was already very clear to him what is going to happen next in his next lifetime, which is that in his next lifetime, he'll be born as a human being, and that will be his last lifetime as a being that is within this cycle of birth and death. That he will have one more birth and that's it. He checks out, no forwarding address. Yeah. And that how he got to that point is due to having cultivated himself for many, many lifetimes, training in what is known as the paramitas, which is the perfections. And it's the perfections of qualities such as generosity, ethical conduct, patience, effort, meditative concentration, wisdom, dedication, knowledge, and so on and so forth. Sometimes there are 6 paramitas, and sometimes there are 10 paramitas. And so in these past lifetimes, when he cultivated these qualities, there are stories that the Buddha would tell. So often in these sutras, when he's instructing someone, he would talk about how at one point, long time ago, it turns out, so pretend like here, I will start telling a story and I will say, long time ago, this happened, and there is a lesson, right, from that story. But then it doesn't stop there. The Buddha will go on and say, and at that time, I was the fox, and Alex, you were the rooster, and William, you were the squirrel. The main characters of that story. Yeah, so through many lifetimes, it is said that he has cultivated himself. In particular, there's the story of one lifetime when it all started, so to say, meaning when what eventually was Siddhartha, made his first resolve that he is going to strive to become a Buddha, an awakened one, which is many, many lifetimes ago when he was a wandering ascetic as well. He met the Buddha, a Buddha, the Buddha of his time, called Dipangara. Some other time I'll tell, if we have a chance, the story there. So eventually then, as this Deva in Tushita, when he knows it's getting close to when he needs to be born into the human realm, he chose his father and his mother. He chose Queen Mahamaya as the mother, and then the king Shuddhodana. And so then there is the story of how Queen Mahamaya had a dream that a white elephant came down from the skies, circumambulated her 3 times, and entered the left side of her body. And that is said to foretell the birth of someone special. It was at that time that she conceived Siddhartha. The early sources, no talk of like magical conception, but there is this talk about when he was conceived, that night the mother had this dream. Then 10 months later, not 9, 10 full months later, he was born on the full moon day of Vaishakha, which is the 5th month of the calendar year, and born in this place called Lumbini. So by the 3rd century, that site was already established as an important site. And it comes from the time of Ashoka. So Ashoka had already built something in Lumbini. It's said that after he was born, his father got these Brahmins to come. So see, Brahmins do figure. So these Brahmins came and made predictions and said that the son is either going to be a great religious figure, a Buddha, an awakened one. So the word Buddha wasn't exclusive to Buddhists. Right? It was just a general term of a being that is free, that is awake, no longer under the power of delusion. So the Brahmin said, your son could become a Buddha, or he could become what's known as a Chakravartin, which means a great, 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 great king. Of course, dad was like, yes, I know what he will be, right? So then the father did everything to provide him a happy and good life. But as we know, whatever the father was able to provide wasn't enough for him. So the father arranged for him to be married to Yashodhara at the age of 19, both of them. And it said that he was provided with 3 palaces for the 3 seasons. So let's go to the next slide. Just some images here. These are all from the Gandhara period, about 2nd, 3rd century. There is Queen Maya having the dream. Here is the birth. So Queen Maya, it said that according to their tradition, women would give birth at their biological family. So she traveled back to her parents' place, but before she could arrive, the birth happened. So it said that she asked them to stop and went into the forest, and she gave birth to Siddhartha while standing. She was holding on to a branch. So you can see that is this depiction of her holding to a branch. And yes, this is a little like what? He came out of her right side. So the elephant went in the right side, not the left side. And then he came out from the right side. There are some speculations that maybe it was a C-section. Yeah, who knows, right? Maybe it's just symbolic, right? Who knows? Then another peculiar story, which if you look at this depiction, the baby was standing. And not only was he standing, he walked. According to these stories, much later stories, not the earliest later, much later stories, he would walk and he took 7 steps. Then after taking 7 steps, he talked. What did he say? He lifted one hand, with one finger he pointed to the sky, with the other hand the finger pointed to the ground, and he said, "Above in the heavens and down on earth, I am supreme." Okay, this kid had confidence. Yeah, and then he proceeded to say, "This is my last birth." Then these stories say, somehow, maybe too traumatic for everyone, everybody forgot that he walked and he talked. Then he went back to being a baby, like most babies, not walking or talking yet. Okay, so that's part of the story too. Next slide. So then, fast forward, he got married and seemingly happily married, but at some point he got disenchanted, and then it is said that the devas, the other devas, his old friends from the realm that he came, they knew what he was supposed to do. Somehow he had temporarily maybe forgotten. So his friends came to instigate. So they say, we need to remind him of what he is to do in this life. So at the same time, it said that Siddhartha got curious. He said, what lies on the other side of this palace? I want to go see. So the father said, oh, no, nothing, it's just boring citizens, like poor people. Why do you want to see them, It's just, nothing interesting. I was like, no, I really want to go out. So apparently dad arranged everything. So he went out and everything was like, oh, okay, well, not so bad. So he came back. But then after a while, he's like, I don't think I saw reality. So he snuck out. And it is said that he snuck out 4 times. The first time, he saw old age. The second time, he saw sickness. The third time, he saw death. And the fourth time, he saw an ascetic. So the first 3 basically created this crisis. So this story, I think in many ways, we are all Siddharthas. Yeah, we live in our palaces with our peacocks and lotus ponds and even mini Zen gardens, right? And think that everything is just fine. And then someday we encounter old age and sickness and death. Right? And you're like, wait, how could Siddhartha live until he was like 29 and not see these things? Well, I'm like 53. I don't know if I've really seen these things. And so one day he saw old age, he saw sickness, he saw death, and then he saw a monk, an ascetic, and he knew what he had to do. So then he snuck out, called the Great Wandering Forth at the age of 29. It said that that night before he left, he went to take a look at his wife who had just given birth to a son for him. And there are some interesting stories, different ways of, different tellings of like what happened when he went to see his wife and child. One story says that he could not see the child because the mother's body was shielding the child. And so in this way, he was able to leave. Some of the story gives like more agency to Yashodhara. It says that Yashodhara knew that he was leaving. And Yashodhara was heartbroken. But Yashodhara also knew that this is what he has to do. And that if she was afraid that if he saw Rahula, the sun, he would not leave. So she purposely shielded Rahula so that Siddhartha could not see. Then he left. Just one slide over. So I want to show you some of these. So this is Siddhartha living a good life. Over there, Siddhartha and Yashoda, still living the good life. And this is the leaving. So he got on his favorite horse, and then his one of his the horse caretaker. So the horse name is Kantaka, and Chana is the guy who took care of his horse. Together they left. Let's go back to one slide. So then, because there were all these groups, so he could wander around to study from a number of people. The first two teachers that he went to, it is said that he lived with them, but it wasn't long before his attainment excelled both of these teachers. And yet he felt he has not found what he was looking for. Then he turned to extreme asceticism. And that also did not take him to where he wanted to get to. He didn't know exactly what it was, but then it said that at one point he remembered that when he was a young man, even like, I think he was maybe 11 actually. It said that during a festival, a plowing festival, that his father was like the chief guest, he sat under a tree, and then somehow he just relaxed his mind, and then very naturally, very spontaneously, his mind just settled. And he remembered that experience. And then he said, maybe I should try that. And he did. And then from there, things got a lot clearer, a lot easier. But that wasn't it. So then he gave up on this extreme asceticism. It said that at one point he only ate a grain of rice a day, because there was also this belief that the body is the problem. The body has held your divine self captive. So if you can practice going beyond your body, then you could be free. So that's why he was practicing this extreme asceticism, to overcome the limitations of the body, to transcend the body. But he found that that's not the answer either. The problem is not with the body. Well, of course, all of you know that, maybe you know or not, the problem is the mind, and not just the mind, a grasping mind. That grasping, fixation, and we'll talk more about that later, is at the root of this problem. So Sujata's offering, this is, never mind. So then he ate. So this woman called Sujata offered him basically rice pudding, rice, milk plus honey. So after he ate that, he renewed his vigor. With renewed vigor, he sat under this pipal tree, which now we call the Bodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment. So then again, on this full moon day of the 5th month, the same day that he was born, it said that. Now, of course, now he's at the age of 35. He achieved Buddhahood. But right before that, it is said that there is this entity called Mara, or the tempter. Mara and his retinue came to challenge him. Now, one of the challenges Mara brought was to say, you don't have what it takes. And then it said, the Buddha says, no, I have. Mara said, what have you done? So it said that the Buddha touched the earth. Then Mother Earth manifested from the earth. And she said, I bear witness to how he has gone through infinite lifetimes cultivating the paramitas. And now everything is perfect. And now the time has come for him to be awake, to be Buddha. So then Mara's technique of self-doubt was overcome. And then it said that Mara, after doubt didn't work, Mara sent temptations. So Mara sent his quote-unquote 3 daughters. And first they were young, and beautiful and youthful and everything, no effect. Then the Mara said, maybe they need to be older. So then got them to be a little older. It's like, well, maybe he's into older women. Didn't work, Then when Mara started to turn them older, apparently his magic stopped working. Then they got older and older and older, and then turned into a pile of bones, according to the story. And so didn't work. Then finally Mara sent his demonic horde with weapons and everything, now using fear. But it said that every weapon that they threw at him turned into a flower. Then enlightenment. The description of the Buddha's enlightenment in all these early sources talked about how his mind entered more and more profound and deeper states of dhyanas or jhanas. These concentrated states of mind. But the concentration isn't necessarily narrow. Right? It was just that it was deep and stable. And as it went into deeper and deeper states of stability, something else was going on. Knowledge emerged. The first knowledge, what I called the first knowledge, it says, that came to him was he could see all his past lifetimes and all the things that he did in all his past lifetimes and what kind of causes brought about what kind of results. He could see clearly and without mistake. So that I would call the karmological knowledge that he gained first. Then second insight that he gained, clear knowledge that he gained, was what I would call cosmological. Then after seeing his own, he could see in that moment all the changes that are going on with the entire universe. Someone passing from this life and being born in another life, someone passing from this life and born in another life, and why they are born in particular life and not in a particular form of life. He could see very clearly and simultaneously the millions and millions and billions of beings. So the first knowledge was his past. The second knowledge is a panoramic present of all beings. And the third is so the second is the cosmological knowledge, and the third is what I would call the dharmological knowledge. The third, he saw what is the cause of all of this comings and goings, and how to put an end to all of this and to achieve freedom. That's the third knowledge. So these days we talk a lot about Buddha, and be a Buddha, be a Buddha, be a Buddha, meaning be awakened, be enlightened, be awakened, be enlightened. But most of the time, people don't go back to these early sources and said, when Siddhartha said that he became Buddha, what the heck did he wake up to? So I think this is important. Otherwise, the word enlightenment could mean anything. Right? It refers to a particular intellectual tradition in Europe, the Enlightenment. And that set of values is not necessarily what is going on over here. Yes? So I would say, if you're going to say, oh, I'm into Buddhism, well, you need to at least know. When it says that the Buddha was Buddha, what was it, So at least the early sources give us these three. Next. Yeah, hold on. So just to show you some of the sculptures here. When he was practicing extreme asceticism, the assault of Mara, depicted here. Oh, here is Sujata offering. And next slide. This is Indonesia. This is the Enlightenment, depicting the enlightened scene. See, there's a monkey here. There's a, I don't know, what is it? Pig? There's a dog here. Okay. And a monkey riding a horse. Okay, next. Yeah.
So I already read that book by
What class?
over like
Uh-huh.
like it like when the Buddha became enlightened, he had like two children disciples, right? One something, not disciples, but like
There were some village kids that would come and talk to him or something.
Yeah, that's creative biography. Not quite. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of stories, but this is like the bare that all traditions kind of agree. These are the things, yeah. So continuing from there, so now he's awake, and then it is said that the gods, the two of the greatest gods, Brahma and Indra, came and asked the Buddha, please now don't remain silent. In fact, Shakyamuni, right, the sage of the Shakyas, Muni also means the silent one. So there's a play of words there. Right? And he could be silent as in literally silent, he doesn't speak. But silence here, the deeper meaning of silence, meaning all the afflictions have been silenced. But nonetheless, it is said that the Buddha was just enjoying this experience of being awake for 7 weeks. Nobody disturbed him. Then Brahma and Indra, the two great gods of the times, in the Magadha area, in the Brahmanical religion, these are considered the two great gods, and it said that they got a little concerned. So then they came and they said, requested the Buddha, please don't forever remain silent. Now you have to teach. Now, part of this story is telling us that, again, in these early sources, Brahma and Indra are seen as benevolent beings. In fact, in some early Buddhist texts, it says, you can only be born in Brahma's company if you cultivate the qualities of love and compassion. So in some ways, Brahma represented love and compassion. So he came and Indra came to entreat, to ask the Buddha to teach. So then the Buddha goes and he finds the 5 ascetics at Deer Park and gave his first teaching on the 4 Noble Truths, called the 4 Noble Truths, at Deer Park. By the way, this wall here with this dreamy forest, it's Deer Park. That's why you have the deer. So this is Deer Park. And at Deer Park, the Buddha came to the 5 monks. These 5 monks were young men sent by his father to retrieve him, to take him back to the kingdom. But it is said that instead of bringing him back, they joined him. But they joined him and they were with him as long as he was practicing extreme asceticism. But once he gave up on that, they thought that he has given up. So they left him. When he came looking for them, the story goes that they saw him. Then one of them said, hey, I think it's Siddhartha. And so then the other one says, let's just ignore him. He has given up on this striving. But it said that when the Buddha came closer and closer and closer, they could tell that something is different about him. And that the power of his virtues, the power of his attainment, was so strong that then they got up and greeted him. And when they asked, what happened? Who are you, Siddhartha? And he says, no, I am awake. There's also a play of names here. Siddhartha means wishes fulfilled, but in the sense of what we would call ordinary worldly success. Father wanted him to have a good name, meaning whatever you wish for will come true. So Siddhartha. So when they asked him, are you Siddhartha? He said, no, I am Buddha, I'm awake. Are you wish fulfilled? No, I'm awake. So then he taught the Four Noble Truths. From there, a lifetime of teaching for 45 years, founded the monastic order, first of only male monastics. Not long after he went back to visit his family, and many of the women in his family wanted to join the order, then he accepted the order of nuns. And then many other stories, that when we look at the other parts of this course, these stories will come back. Then at the age of 80, the great passing away, the Mahaparinirvana. And it said that after he passed away, then they cremated his body and they found all these special relics that was divided into 10 parts. 8 parts were given to the 8 kings that were powerful in that area. 1 part was given to the priest, and the Brahmin. Again, there's the Brahmin figures here. A Brahmin priest who conducted the funeral. And then the 10th part is said that the Devas took up into the godly realms. And so the relics of the 8 kings became the basis of the building of stupas in the Buddhist culture. So some of the stupas from Ashoka's time still stand to this day. In theory, there are Buddha's remains in there. Then his disciples gathered together and came together to repeat his teachings orally. And then everybody listened to it and say, yes, we agree, this was what he taught. Yes, we agree, this is what he taught. And then from there it says, okay, now we have to keep this in memory, we have to recite them. And so it was an oral tradition, like many other religious traditions during that time. Can you click? I know we're running out of time now. So let's see, some of the stories, monkey offering honey to the Buddha. This was at a time when the Buddha, so even though a Buddha, his monastic community at one time kept fighting amongst themselves. And so he got so fed up with them, he said, I'm leaving. And even that, they did not notice that he left. So he just left and went into the forest, and it said that monkeys came and offered honey to him and attended him while his disciples were fighting. So that's that story there. This is a peculiar story about how he went up to one of the heavenly realms that his mother, who died 7 days after he was born, his mother died. And so then at a certain point, he went up to that realm to teach his mother what he had discovered. And this is a depiction of him coming down from a ladder from that realm. Another one of these kind of like mysterious stories, like what was that about, Next slide. These are the stupas. So the passing of the Buddha, and these are This is probably the oldest one that they have excavated so far. This is restored very nicely. And this is a depiction, a very old depiction of an ancient stupa. Very similar, I think, to. And this is depicting also the Buddha, that same slide that you saw coming from after teaching his mother. So yeah, some of the Buddha's life and lives. Any questions?
So all of that is basically what all of the disparate traditions would basically agree on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I've tried to just focus on across all Buddhist traditions, this basic story everybody recognizes. Yes.
So I got like the wheel of life and stuff was like, didn't die forever. It's like infinite. We had made that custom of the house. What was it called?
Yes.
Yeah, some other time. Yeah, that one.
So then, if it's infinite, how many times did you reverse? Because it's not necessarily infinite.
Until you put an end to it, it will keep continuing.
So then, what do you mean you put it in?
Well, some other lectures,
Well, how do you know you?
There is like Chinese historical, in the history of China, there's also like, it seems like a tradition of people going out that spreads across religious traditions. Does that connect to?
Yeah, maybe, but I don't think, India had any influence of that sort, so to say. I mean, like people checking out, we all get that. Check out to do what? That may be their variations. People checking out and saying, don't come looking for me. Yeah. Last week we talked about mind, right? The story of Milarepa and the boy. So then the boy comes back, right, and say the mind is this and mind is that. Then Milarepa says, go keep searching. What is this mind? Right? So this mind, without getting philosophical, without getting metaphysical, which fundamentally, I would say, Buddha's teachings, the Buddha Dharma. Buddha Dharma, one definition of Buddha Dharma is the Dharma as taught by the Buddha. That, I would say, is a superficial meaning. Dharma meaning like the teachings or even the truth taught by the Buddha. I would say that's a superficial meaning of Buddha Dharma. Well, back up a little bit. I tend to distinguish between Buddha Dharma and Buddhism. For me, Buddhism is in the plural. Buddha Dharma is one. But what that one is, of course, not so clear. Yeah? But it's one, as in, right? There is a certain unity to all the different parts, right? That it all comes together in a unified vision. So the Buddha Dharma. Buddha Dharma is what the Buddha taught. The Buddha not limited to this historical figure. Next week, we're going to talk about very early in this Buddhist community, there was already this question of what does it mean to be a Buddha? And what is the nature of a Buddha? That's what we're going to look at in the next class. So whatever this Buddha is, and including this historical instance of someone saying, I am Buddha, right? What he taught is Buddha Dharma. Then this Buddha Dharma interacting with human history becomes particular instances of Buddhism. And since these teachings that he taught primarily came down to us through what we would identify as religious context, in that way, Buddha Dharma is religion. In the sense of, it interacted mostly with religious elements. So it has come down to us as religion. But Buddha Dharma need not fundamentally be religious. If it had taken the, I don't know, psychological vocabulary and development, then it would have come down to us through that. But it went the religious route. So Buddhism, and there are instances of Buddhism, and there are so many different types of Buddhism, right? Now, Buddha Dharma. Superficial meaning of Buddha Dharma is the Dharma taught by the Buddha. A more important meaning of Buddha Dharma, I would say, is the Dharma that makes us a Buddha. The truth that will wake us up is the real meaning of Buddha Dharma. That Dharma being truth, the truth that will wake us up, that will make us Buddhas. So fundamentally, Buddha Dharma is not philosophy, it's not metaphysics, it's not religion. Just as when the Buddha in another instance was asked, what are you? Again, someone else, this is in some other case, someone else is recorded asking Siddhartha, what are you? Because they could tell there's something different about him. And they said, are you human? And Buddha said, no. Then he said, are you Deva? He said, no. So basically they went through all these categories that made sense to them. And then they said, well, are you a yaksha? He said, no. I said, then what are you? He says, I am Buddha. Something completely outside of their reference point. Likewise, there's Buddha Dharma. The closest I would say what Buddha Dharma is in terms of its function is, I would say, it's a form of therapy. But please don't substitute your therapy with Buddha Dharma. It's not going to work, okay? Continue your therapy, please, whatever therapy you are relying on. When I say that the Buddha Dharma is therapy, I'm saying that it's closest to the idea of we are not well, and in order to get well, we have to follow a particular discipline, a particular set of prescriptions and proscription, what is good for our health and what is not good for our health, what sorts of habits to adopt and what sorts of habits to get out, to get rid of, so that we become better. Now, as Buddha Dharma went through the ages, it had to develop philosophy. It had to develop metaphysics. It had to develop religion. It had to develop ritual systems. No choice, because that's the stuff of being human. So it's not a sellout. It's like humans need all these things. So Buddhists develop these things. But Buddha Dharma itself is not necessarily any of these things. So mind, coming back to mind. Of course, when we use that word, instantly you think of it in psychological terms, you think of it in metaphysics terms, or you think of it in philosophical terms, or religious terms. Try your best to take it out of all those, right? And put it in the context of experiential. So don't get hung up on mind, consciousness, self, soul. Yeah. Doesn't matter what word you use. Know that what we are talking about is that which allows you to know and to experience. Don't impute any kind of further qualities to it except this. It is that which allows us to know and to experience. Then, what is that? Can we learn how it behaves? Does it always turn up the same way? Meaning, is it always this color or that color? Does it have a color? Does it have a shape? So sometimes when we read about this, some of you have read things like that, and you think, what do you mean color and shape? Okay, it doesn't literally have to mean color and shape. It basically is challenging you to consider. If you think I am XYZ, that's the color and the shape that we're talking about. Look into that. Am I always consistently this way or that way? When you begin to look into that, Milarepa tells the boy, what you thought of before and you were so sure about before becomes less clear. Becomes less clear. Initially, this becoming less clear might bring some anxieties. But if you keep leaning into that, that fear of falling might turn into something else. But look into that. Then at this point in the Milarepa story, Milarepa said to the boy, for you to embark on this journey, you need protection. Because it is a little unnerving, right? Because you're dissolving whatever little security that you thought you had in knowing who this is, what this is. You're starting to dissolve that. You're starting to destabilize that. And that is a little unnerving. So you need protection. Like guardrails. And what is this guardrail? This is what we call refuge. Refuge. And that's why it's often said the first step in practicing the Buddha Dharma is to take refuge. Take refuge in the Buddha, take refuge in the Dharma, and take refuge in the Sangha. But principally, it is actually taking refuge in Buddha. Now, of course, the immediate reference point, the easy one, is the story I've just told you about. This personality, this example, Siddhartha, Shakyamuni, Gautama, Buddha. But that's the superficial aspect. That's just the start. To take refuge in the Buddha, the deeper meaning of that is, can you have a little bit of trust that it is possible to wake up? And that others have done it? And that the story of Siddhartha is the story of becoming Buddha. Yeah, we don't need, to Like go back in time and find this real person, even if that option is available. We don't need to do that. What we need to do in terms of taking refuge is to say, this story, whether myth or actual fact, serves as a good template, and I trust that it is possible to wake up. To gain those states of mind, deeper and deeper states of mental stillness and quiet, and then from there to gain the knowledges, to be able to see cause and effect in all its, complexity of not only my stuff, but everyone's. And then to see completely what holds us back, what controls us, and how to become free. Can you believe that? The moment you can believe that moment we say, you have taken refuge. You have entered the path. Yeah, so what is refuge? And Milarepa starts to instruct the boy in the way that I was just talking about. And also a play of names, play of words with the boy's name, actually. The boy's name literally is something like, lay person or something like that. But it was a Tibetan name. Tibetan often use like a lot of Buddhist terms in their names, and people don't really think about what it really means, So Milarepa was playing with his name and say, your name is a lay person, meaning by definition, someone who has taken refuge in the Buddha. Do you know what that is? He asked the boy. The boy was like, I don't know. And the Buddha introduced and say, for this, if you want to know more about this mind, it's a little treacherous to do it completely without guardrails. And so take refuge. Take refuge. Then once you begin to apply the potentially destabilizing teachings and techniques and trainings, but when you have the safeguarding of refuge, then you don't have to fear going too far off. Then there's the Dharma, the teachings. Then there's the Sangha, meaning those who have applied these teachings and tasted certainty with regards to those teachings. So Sangha as a refuge, even though the word Sangha simply means community, like here, temporarily at least, we are a community right now, but then we are not a refuge in that sense, in this sense. In this sense, it has to be referring to those who have taken the Dharma into their own experience and reach a particular level of certainty that, yes, I know what this means. I know what this is. And therefore have the ability to guide others. So that's refuge. So we already exceeded the time allocated for tonight. I apologize for that. But next time we meet, I think we should be able to end right on time. Thank you for coming out.